Good evening. My name is Linda K. Hughes, and I hold an endowed position in the Department of English as Addie Levy Professor of Literature, and have taught at TCU for 21 years. Tonight I want to talk to you about John Keats' negative capability and the power of liberal arts critical thinking. Negative capability sounds so negative, but I want to argue that in formulating negative capability, Keats presented a great idea to the world with applications not only to my field of literature, but also a range of disciplines. Negative capability, as Keats defines it, is in fact an intrinsic part of liberal arts critical inquiry, which is one of the most powerful tools that we have at our disposal as thinkers, as citizens, and human beings seeking meaning in our lives. The originator of this great idea is poet John Keats, whose short life ended tragically from tuberculosis in 1821 when he was only 25. Many of you will recognize one of Keats's lines from the poem Endymion, published in 1818, because Hallmark Card Company appropriated it as an advertisement. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Perhaps some of you also saw the 2009 film Bright Star, directed by Jane Campion, which is based on Keats's life and features several of his poems read aloud. Almost no one would have been likely to predict at his birth that this fellow was going to achieve such lasting fame. He was the son of a stable manager and had only 8 years of education before he was sent to study as a surgeon at age 16. While still a teenager, however, Keats read The Faerie Queene by Elizabethan poet Edmund Spenser, and it changed his life forever. Afterwards, Keats managed in 5 short years to become a truly great lyric poet, a feat that is unmatched in literary history. Another indication of his remarkable gifts is the letter he wrote to his brothers, Tom and George, in December 1817, when Keats was still only 22, the age when most of our TCU undergraduates get their BAs. The letter identifies a quality essential to literary greatness: negative capability. That is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. For Keats, the grand exemplar of negative capability is Shakespeare, whose secret, Keats is saying, is that he can explore ideas, situations, characters, as far as possible without rushing to judgment or into a safety net of certainty. Instead, Shakespeare could fearlessly examine whatever he confronted, staying open to multiple possibilities and going wherever inquiry and imagination took him. Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, which you have before you, also demonstrates negative capability. Keats creates purely through words an encounter with history as the speaker imaginatively contemplates a Greek vase fashioned by human hands centuries earlier. The vase survives, but its originator and original meaning do not. Because the vase maker cannot tell us what each figure means or what he or she meant to convey, the urn is, as Keats says in line 2, the foster child of silence and slow time, preserved by time, yet also permanently sequestered within mystery. As Keats states in his last stanza, the urn therefore does tease us out of thought as doth eternity. The poem never does tell us outright what the urn means, but it does invite us to explore what the urn suggests about the mysteries of time, mortality, and alien cultures, and the paradoxes that urn presents to our understanding. Confronting a vase in which we see a shepherd playing his pipes, for example, brings the idea of music very close to us, but we have to imagine what that music might sound like. And Keats challenges us to consider whether it's more meaningful to hear that original Greek music or to activate all the resources of our minds and imaginations to conceive of that music from within. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on. The poem ends, ironically, with the urn speaking after all, with a little help from the poet. But as it asserts, beauty is truth. Truth, beauty, that is all you know on earth and all you need to know. Surely these lines are also designed to tease readers out of thought. We may love truth, but is it always beautiful? Mortality, for example, there's an undisputable truth of life. But is it beautiful? Can't beauty sometimes seduce, lie, distort? On the other hand, can't the experience of beauty sometimes be so intense and revelatory that it creates its own form of truth? Keats leaves us in a state of negative capability, for we have to puzzle out the matter for ourselves. If negative capability, that ability to immerse oneself in mysteries and doubts without shying away from them, is a hallmark of Shakespeare and Keats, we can also find it in 20th century work. On the back of your handout, you'll find Photo After Pogrom, first published in 1961 by poet and visual artist Nina Lloyd. Lloyd was born in London to a Jewish father of Hungarian descent and an English mother, and eventually settled in the United States in 1936. Photo After Pogrom responds to the Holocaust, a World War II, though Lloyd uses the older term pogrom, which refers to organized Eastern European massacres of Jews in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, a reminder that the Holocaust had a long prehistory. One of the challenges haunting Holocaust studies is how to take up the subject of genocide without trivializing it or exploiting the deaths of millions. Lloyd finds a way into her topic by following a strategy. She writes about a visual representation, here a photo, rather than a painted urn. Her poem makes us see the Jewish victims murdered and casually tossed on a heap of bodies. But her image of the dead resists the murderer's intent to reduce them to rubbish. Frozen into rigor mortis, and as Lloyd imagines, into a photograph, a woman's body becomes utterly beautiful, her mouth opened at the moment of death in what seems to be a smile. Her body attains the absolute smile of dispossession. The poem, then, juxtaposes the horrific realities of racial hatred and putrefying corpses, and the aesthetic beauty of the dead within a photograph, and by implication, within Lloyd's own poem. One reason Lloyd may be questioning the medium of art is the famous statement by philosopher and theorist Theodor Adorno in 1955. To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. Two of Adorno's possible implications are that aspiring to beauty after the Holocaust represents a retreat from moral atrocity, or that participating in poetic tradition makes the poet complicit in the very culture that led up to the Holocaust. By harnessing the power of negative capability, however, and filtering her poem through the imagery of an imagined photograph, Lloyd distances us from the immediacy of mass murder so that we can bear to think about it. Reading the poem, we get close to the murdered corpse in a way we never could or would in real life. And Lloyd keeps us thinking by her punning phrase, unassumed composure. Unassumed usually indicates a lack of pretense, but we can be brought up short by realizing that there can be no pretense in the dead, for they've been deprived of all human agency. And since composure plays upon the term composition, which is essential to any photograph, the poem may also be questioning whether the photograph has assumed full moral responsibility for the way it depicts murdered Jews. Like Keats, Lloyd ends her poem teasing us out of thought, announcing corpses are virgin. The utterly violated body of a murdered woman emerges with frightening clarity in Lloyd's poem, but also resists the ability of anyone, artists included, to penetrate its full meaning, even though it demands that we try. The power of negative capability isn't limited to literature any more than literature itself is a self-enclosed form cut off from society and social meaning. Increasingly, scientists and evolutionary psychologists are taking a fresh look at the arts, which are a universal feature of human cultures without exception. And they're suggesting, in the words of Michael Gazzaniga, that the arts are not the frosting on the cake, but the baking soda. As Gazzaniga points out in Human, the Science That Makes Us Unique, published in 2008, the arts emerged around the same time our frontal cortex did, and seemed to play an essential role in keeping and retaining the plasticity of the brain, whether by enabling us to enter into a fictional world in our minds while staying aware of reality at the same time, or by building up a reservoir of possible scenarios and solutions. As Gazzaniga says, the more fictional stories we hear, the more circumstances we become familiar with, without having to actually experience them. If we do run across the same circumstances in life, then we'll have a wealth of background to draw from. If scientists are newly appreciating the adaptive advantages of literature, I also want to suggest that some 20th century breakthroughs in science depend on negative capability as defined by Keats. A prime example, I'd suggest, is the discovery that light can behave both as a particle and a wave, a solution to the long-standing problem that Albert Einstein himself figured out at age 26, and for which he received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1921. Now, don't worry, you're not going to hear a lecture on physics from an English professor. Rather, what fascinates me is the kind of thinking that was required to move beyond the dominant conception of light that prevailed in the 19th century, when it was conceptualized as an electromagnetic wave. That wave theory itself had won out over competing ideas of light as fast-moving particles or a propagating wave that dated back to the 17th century. Common sense dictated that one solution or the other had to be right. But Einstein practiced negative capability, and he didn't retreat from the almost baffling possibility that light could manifest both properties, especially since it was known that light beams aimed at a metal sheet ejected electrons as if particles were hitting the metal. And his solution, light manifests as both particles and waves, was later verified experimentally and has had immense implications for both theoretical and applied physics. If negative capability has applications for literature and for science, I want to conclude by suggesting that negative capability remains a great idea that we sorely need today in our lives at the civic, national, and international level. Civilization has long been global, as witnessed sailing ships or later underseas telegraphic cables. But electronic media and the internet have intensified and sped up the traffic of information and commerce, even as our technology is having global effects on our biosphere. In an era when information and problems are so complex, and when so many millions are accessing information and expressing their opinions through blogs or other forms, arriving at public and international policies has become ever more challenging. Negative capability is thus an idea that has never been more timely. Our very survival may depend in the end, on our ability to coexist with mysteries, uncertainties, doubts, since any rush to judgment or oversimplification of resistant complex data is bound to lead to bad analysis and bad policy. Another word in Keats's formulation remains crucial: irritable. Keats is primarily using the word in its physiological sense. Let's not forget he studied medicine. And he indicates through it extreme sensitivity of an organ or an individual to be prompted into action. But as a poet, of course, he also knows about the implications of anger or anxiety. If negative capability means resisting the impulse to grab onto certainties as a knee-jerk response to radical uncertainty, it also means avoiding ill tempers. Our desperate need for this is evident from almost any recent news cycle, whether in the form of violence abroad by factions so wedded to certainties that they cease to see their opponents as human beings, or here at home, whether it's yelling on the streets or even nose biting. Negative capability is one of the great ideas of history then, but as fresh as the messages that have arrived on your cell phones during this brief lecture. It owes its formulation to poet John Keats, but has applications to literature, science, international relations, and more. In the end, negative capability is also a key feature of liberal arts critical thinking, which approaches the analysis of complex problems and competing solutions in a spirit of disinterestedness, working to find the best possible answers rather than rushing to quick answers that are bound to irritate, or worse, in the long run. Every time ADRAM professors prompt students to look at evidence on the other side, or to explore a problem at length, struggling with the gray area between ideas without hurrying into a premature conclusion, they too are building on and extending John Keats's legacy of negative capability. Thank you.